Okay, so welcome. My name is Dmitry Farber. I've been teaching for Manhattan Prep for just creeping up on 10 years now. I teach GMAT and GRE in addition to LSAT, but for a long time I was one of the curriculum developers and managers for the LSAT brand. And although I'm focusing more on teaching now, I did a lot of the work on the books that you'll see. Today I want to talk about one of those books and how it can help you with your logical reasoning prep. So let's run through a few things. Um, of course, as always, you can check out our website to learn more about upcoming classes, whether you want to sit in as a trial or try our LSAT Interact program. The theme for today is going to be famous flaws, things that show up again and again in logical reasoning, not just on questions that are explicitly asking you for a flaw, but on all the assumption family questions. So when you're looking for necessary and sufficient assumptions, when you're looking to strengthen or weaken the argument, some of the principal questions, we're looking for what's wrong with the argument. And I'm also going to highlight some exercises from our 5-pound book of LSAT drills. Yes, we made a 5-pound book. It just came out recently. If you want some additional practice, it's a great resource for that. When we first came out with this book or came up with the idea of this book, I thought it was a little strange since there are already many pounds worth of official LSAT problems to do. But the idea here is to drill you down more into something that you might not see from LSAT materials, which is spotting particular patterns and working on the micro skills that make up your approach to each section. So I think from that point of view, it's a different kind of study than doing a bunch of LSAT problems, and there's a lot of value to that. So hopefully I can get you excited about doing some of that today. The idea is that when we're doing the LSAT, certain tricks show up again and again. They're not working with a blank slate. And so when you see a bad argument, often the bad arguments will fall into certain categories. You will see that those categories are repeated in terms of your ability to spot what's wrong with an argument, but they're also often referred to directly in answer choices. So on a flaw question, which of the following is a flaw in the author's reasoning, we'll look at the answer choices and say, oh, these keep showing up again and again, and I can even see the exact language that describes them. All right, and so some of the answer choices will say, the author mistakes sufficient for necessary or something like that. And you want to be able to spot those errors when they show up. So I want to try a couple of the drills from the 5-pound book, talk through them. And one of them is just putting names to some of the common flaws. Now, you may or may not have done a lot of this kind of prep, so these names may not be familiar to you. By the way, if you just joined us, welcome. Feel free to jump into the chat and say hi. Let me know you're hearing me okay. And let me know when you're taking your test and what your prep history has been so far. And it's a private chat, so I'll be seeing it, but it's useful to be able to know that. So let me put the drill up. I'm going to give you a few minutes to try it. What I'd like you to do is just let me know when you're ready on this one. That could be immediately because you don't know what to do with this, right? Or it could be in a few minutes when you've had a chance to try a lot of them out. I'm not expecting that anyone has memorized this particular list of flaw types that you see at the bottom. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, though, the idea is these are 12. They're not the only 12, but these are 12 common reasoning errors that LSAT arguments will make. There are 12 common reasoning errors. So I'll put them in a nice purple box. And the idea is looking at these 12 common reasoning errors, which of these 12 arguments is which? So we're going to have one of each, no tricks there. One of these arguments will use an ad hominem. One of them will be an appeal to inappropriate authority. Some of these terms will already be familiar to you. And so you can just say, oh, yep, I know that one. Others might not be so, and you might get there by process of elimination. That's part of getting good at the LSAT. So I'm not going to talk about what these are. They're described already, and we'll discuss in a few minutes. So take a little time to try matching these up, and let me know when you're ready. If I haven't heard from someone in a little while, I will just jump back on. Talk to you in a few. All right, let's talk through some of these. So I'm guessing some felt more natural than others. How did it go? Grace, looks like you're ready. How did you do with the identification? Did a lot of these jump out at you? Anyone else feel free to chat it in. Okay, a lot of them felt good. All right, cool. So let's make sure we know what all these are. And what one way we might do it is instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we'll just run through the list of flaws and try to match them up. So an ad hominem attack, sometimes we think of that as a purely like you propose something and someone goes, yeah, well, you're ugly, right? It's just a pure just attack on you. Which of these numbers is an ad hominem? Which of these is that kind of attack? Number 6. Yeah, so number 6 is a form of ad hominem, right? One form of ad hominem, like I said, is just purely just attacking the person for no good reason at all. But perhaps a more common one and a more subtle one is where we have a reason to attack them, but that doesn't mean they're wrong, right? So if someone's biased, right? If I think, if I tell you that my child's a genius, you might think, well, of course, lots of parents think their kids are geniuses, right? But you can say, hey, well, maybe I shouldn't just take Dimitri's word for it. That would be sound reasoning. But saying that therefore she's not one, that would be a leap, right? We don't know that my child's not a genius just because I think she is and I'm biased. Okay, cool. Um, you could call that an appeal to inappropriate authority as well, right? If I say something, you might say, well, how do you know what a genius is? You're not the appropriate person to judge that, right? But we specifically call something an appeal to inappropriate authority when we're citing just the wrong person for the job. So which number does that? Which of these seems to cite the wrong person or describe someone citing the wrong person? Yeah, number 4, right? So sometimes I'll just call this appeal to authority because honestly, any appeal to authority, whether it's appropriate or not, is by definition somewhat flawed, right? So if I say something like, Dimitri's an LSAT teacher and he says the answer is C, so it is, that's tricky because on the one hand, hey, if I'm an LSAT teacher, I probably have a pretty good idea about what the answer is. But what if another LSAT teacher says it's D? Now what, right? Or what if I'm the only LSAT teacher but I turn out to be wrong, right? So if an economist tells you that, that the economy is going to collapse next year, do you automatically believe them? So even an appropriate authority can be a problem, right? If a doctor says you definitely don't have a sinus infection, can you be sure they're right? But if a doctor tells you that you should believe in astrology, right? Or if your dentist tells you that the economy is going to collapse next year, then again, they could be right. We can't. It would be an ad hominem to say they're wrong, right? So these are in some ways like flips of each other. I can't say, well, you're just a dentist, so you don't know. But I certainly can't cite them very reliably from that perspective. Okay. Causation flaws. Now, some of these are much more important than others, and I'd say causation flaws are one of the more important ones. And in fact, I did a whole free prep hour on causation. It's the last one I did in January, so if you want to look that up on YouTube, you can. But which one of these is dealing with causal trouble? See us talking about whether something happened or not. And when we want to know what caused something, it's certainly, I can't say, it's tricky. Like if I think that smoking causes cancer, and I use a particular case as an example, I certainly have to know whether smoking and cancer were both there. Like, did that person smoke? Do they really have cancer? Right. But usually I'm going to do causal arguments in cases where I know both the things are there. That's where they most likely get in trouble. When we know both the things are there, but how do we know that one caused the other? It's not the only way for it to play out. 3 uses the word causally, which certainly helps. They won't always do that, right? And what these are abstract. So it's number 3. These are abstract descriptions of the flaws. Obviously, on the real LSAT, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. On the real LSAT, we're often going to have to be looking at an actual argument and how are they proceeding. So a causation flaw might say something direct, like, I don't know, my friend took an LSAT class and got a 180, so the LSAT class must have been, why she got a 180. Or it could be implied because I could say, oh, my friend took an LSAT class and got a 180, so you should take that class too. I didn't say the class caused her 180, but I seem to think so. I seem to be assuming so. Otherwise, why do I want you to take the class, right? If she got a 180 just because she happens to be really good at the LSAT and the class didn't matter, then why am I telling you to take it, right? Okay. So then circular reasoning, unlike causation flaw, circular reasoning is not terribly important. You want to know what it means and you want to recognize the language that describes it, but you're very unlikely to actually see circular reasoning on the LSAT. And I'll come to a second why. So which one is that? Grace is saying number 1. Yeah, right. Presuppose what it sets out to establish. Now this is tricky. And I think one reason they don't do it on the LSAT is it's hard to know when that's a flaw and when that isn't, right? If I tell you something like, Fred's on trial for murder, we should go ahead and convict him because obviously only a murderer would be on trial for murder. That more or less feels like circular logic because I'm saying he's on trial, therefore he's guilty, right? But you could try to say, well, no, but just an innocent person would never look guilty or something like that. You could. It's not a very good argument. You could. But what if I said something like, Fred's innocent, and I know it because he didn't do it. He'd say, well, wait a minute. Well, yeah, sure. If he didn't do it, he's innocent. But like, that's what I'm wanting to know. How do you know he didn't do it? Well, he didn't do it because he's innocent. But why not, right? You could just go around in circles with this. The problem is that on the LSAT, we generally accept the premises, right? In real life, we don't have to. If I try to convert you to some new religion that you'd never heard of, and I said, hey, well, don't take my word for it. It says right here in my book that the religion is correct. You might say, well, but I don't believe your religion, so I'm not going to believe your book, right? Oh, I hadn't thought of that, right? And so in that case, you might throw my thing out. I just made that religion up today, right? But if you accept my premise, if you really believed that everything in my book was true, then you'd accept if the book said it was true too. You'd accept that too. And so circular logic is kind of weird. It's either perfect or terrible depending on how you look at it, right? You know what I mean? If I say I'm not a child because I'm an adult, that's trivially true, yeah. But if you're not sure if I really am an adult, then it doesn't help you, right? Okay, cool. Comparison flaw is a very wide category of flaws, but they're all flaws around comparisons. And so these are more common. And as we'll go, I'll mark some of the probably the most crucial ones. We definitely want to be able to spot causation flaws. We definitely want to be able to spot comparison flaws. These are two of the more common flaws. Which one of these is a comparison flaw? Yeah, number 8. So what's going on is it's saying because two phenomena is a funny word, right? Sometimes we think of a phenomenon as something amazing. If you talk about an athlete, oh, she's such a phenomenon, right? It means something amazing. In our terminology, a phenomenon is just a thing, something that exists, something that happened. And so it's just two things. So the argument's presuming without justification. That's another just way of saying falsely assuming or assuming, and we don't know for sure it's true, that when two things are alike in one way, they're also alike in another. And that's a comparison flaw. And that can go a couple different ways. I can say something like, hey, you and I, for instance, have the same political beliefs, therefore we'll probably also have the same taste in music. Well, how do we know that? Or it could be a thing of saying one thing is better or worse or more or less than the other. So if I said, I'm taller than you, so I must weigh more than you. Or product X is more expensive than product Y, so it's also more expensive to make than product Y, right? It's anytime we make one comparison and we're assuming that we can make other comparisons. And basically you can't do that, right? All you can, if I know that product X costs more than product Y, all you can infer is that product Y costs less than product X. Right? That's not very interesting, right? That's the only comparison you can make. It may be true that product X costs more to make, or it may be true that product X is more profitable, or that product Y sells more. We don't know any of that, right? So comparison flaw is anytime we go from one comparison to other comparisons that don't have to follow. Okay. And this shows up a lot because there's a lot of different kinds of comparisons. It's one of the basic things the LSAT does over and over again is compare. Just like pretty much all logic games, put elements into order or put elements into groups or some combination of the two. You could say that almost every LR question you're going to see is going to deal with causation, comparisons, or conditional. Some people call them the 3 C's or some combination of those. And we could argue about that. There might be individual ones that don't quite seem to fit in those categories, but pretty much you could say that those factors are always there. Okay, now a false choice. False choice. I'm assuming some options, but those might not be the options. All right. What would be an example of that? Yeah. And number 5 is a false choice. There's more than one way you could think about those words, false choice. One could be something like, I literally force you to choose between 2 things, but you don't have to choose, you know. Do you want dinner or dessert? And you're like, I want both. But in this case, we're dealing with assumptions and logic, right? Logical errors. And basically I'm saying, oh, you know, that same thing, dinner versus dessert, I can say, oh, you ate dinner, so you must not be planning to have dessert. Well, who said that, right? Or, you know, some things we might grant. Like if I say something like, Karen is Christian, so she's not Buddhist. That makes sense. Most people are one religion or none, right? Not very many people are 2. But unless I know that you can only be one religion, I can't say that for sure. But sometimes it just might be like, I'm overlooking a third possibility. So I say it's like, Karen's not Christian, therefore she must be Buddhist. It's like, well, are those the only choices? Do you have to be Christian or Buddhist? All right. Who said? Sometimes it seems like there are only 2 choices, and the LSAT can be very, very, very tricky with that because it might seem like, you know, you have only 2 options and there's some subtle little other possibility. They do that on logic games, for instance, when they say, you know, X can't be before Y. And you say, aha, great. So X is after Y. Wait, what if they're at the same time? So sometimes it's those little assumptions. How do we know it's not that? Okay. Illegal reversal. Now, this is another really, really common one. And when I say reversal, some people are like, I don't know, what do you mean? You reversed your logical position? We're talking about conditional logic, right? We're talking about conditional logic. And this is another of the most common things on the entire test. If you don't know your conditional logic, if you don't know your illegal reversals, don't take the LSAT yet, really, right? That's one of the central things to this test. So if you're new to the LSAT, you're going to see a ton of this stuff. And the idea is basically when I say something like, hey, you know, if you're sick, you'll cough, right? So, or, well, you could do the other way, right? If I could say, if someone has a cough, then they're sick. But does that mean that if they're sick, they have a cough, right? Oh, those don't have to be the case. Maybe you have another kind of illness. And notice I could have been given the other one. Maybe all people who are sick cough, right? Maybe being sick always makes you cough. Then if you're coughing, does that mean you're sick? Could there be another reason you're coughing? That's an illegal reversal. What's the reversal I can do? So if I know that all people who cough are sick, what can I infer? What is legal to do? Yeah, I can say the contrapositive, which is if you're not sick, you will not cough. Again, this is assuming that the original premise, granting, I should say, that the original premise is true. If we accept that everyone who coughs is sick, in real life, of course, it may not be, then we could say, all right, well, then if you're not sick, you're not going to cough anytime, right? That would be a legal reversal because it's reversing and negating, right? Which is the contrapositive. You'll get into a lot of that if you haven't already. Okay. Cool. So illegal reversal is another of the very, very common patterns, and it would fit into the broader category of conditional logic errors. We can also see illegal negations, but those are really the same thing. If I say, if you don't cough, you're not sick, that actually means the same thing as if you're sick, you cough. I'm not going to get into detail about that because that's not the theme of today. But if that's news to you, it's something to watch with conditional logic. Okay. All right. That gets us up to part versus whole. Which number is that? Think about reasoning from part to whole or from whole to part. We do have to be careful about that. No, it's not 10. We'll come back to 10. Yeah, like imagine I said something like, your body is made up of tiny individual cells. So you are a tiny individual cell. You'd say, what? What are you talking about, right? My body isn't made up of tiny individual cells. I mean, sorry, my body is made up of, yes, it is. I'm not denying that. I believe in cells. I'm not a tiny individual cell. I'm made of them. That's not the same thing, right? Or if I said, in the reverse, you're intelligent and thoughtful, therefore all the cells in your body are intelligent and thoughtful, you might say, are you sure? This random skills, these, thousands of skin cells that are flaking off when I touch my hand, are those all each intelligent and thoughtful? I don't know about that. So that is a part to whole relationship. And although part versus whole by itself, you might not think of as the most common, if you combine it with the next two that just happen to be in alphabetical order, percent versus amount and sampling, these are a lot of statistical flaws. And as a group, I'd say they're very important. I've had some students, I had one student who was tracking in the 170 range and ended up having to retake. And one thing we noticed was numerical questions kept coming up, sort of mathy questions. Some people are like, the whole beauty of the LSAT is I don't have to do math, right? If I wanted that, I could take the GRE and get into law school, right? But there's a little bit of mathy reasoning, right? You don't have to do you don't have to solve for X. But we do have to think about numerical stuff. So that's part versus whole. Number 10 is our next one, right? Number 10 is percent versus amount. Do we see the difference? When I'm making a claim about proportion versus numeric, and that's very abstract in the way it's worded, right? But the idea is, if I say something like, let's say I told you, for instance, that a larger percent of people in the US are pet owners than in China. Does that tell you that the US has more pets? Right? A larger percent of Americans than Chinese citizens are pet owners. So are there more pets in the US? Well, hold on a second, right? Notice there's a couple of flaws there. One is, of course, I'm assuming similar population sizes. Since we know China is several times larger in population than the US, then let's say the US, let's say 50% of Americans have pets, and let's say there's 300 million of us. That would be 150 million people who have pets. And then let's say China, let's say they only have, let's say China maybe only 30% of people have pets, but it's 30% of maybe 1.2 billion. I don't know what the current population of China, but in that realm, right? Well, that would be still a whole lot more than us, right? You don't have to do this math. But the point is that half of 300 million is still a lot less than 30% of 1.2 billion. You could probably do that without doing any calculation, right? And then I made another error when I said that, because I said US has more pets. Well, hold on, we just talked about people who have pets. Maybe in the US more people have pets, but in China, when you do have pets, you might have a lot of pets. So imagine here on average, we have 1 or 2 pets, but most folks in China don't have a pet, but when they do have one, they have like 12 or 20 or something, right? They have a larger rural population than we do. That might make sense, right? Okay. So that's percent versus amount. And then a related concept is sampling. Which one is that? We're running out of choices and the keywords help here, but which number is sampling flaw? 11. Yeah. This is where I say, hey, everyone I talked to at the Bernie Sanders rally really wants Bernie to be president, so I think he's going to win. It's like, well, wait a minute. You know that a Bernie Sanders rally is not a random sampling of the population, right? Now, that's a very obvious one, of course, but the problem is that any sample, right? Whether it's simply, hey, I've noticed that the lawn signs I see are mostly in support of candidate X, so they're going to win. Well, hold on. Are you in a neighborhood that's very tilted toward one party or the other? Also, maybe the people who vote for candidate X are more likely to have lawn signs or lawns for that matter, right? And so any disproportion in any other factor that might explain the why one sample is overrepresented is can be troublesome. What if I call people at home at noon to do a survey about employment and find that a lot of people are unemployed? It's like, well, wait, maybe unemployed people are more likely to be home at noon than employed people, right? Anything like that could throw the sample off is something to watch out for. Right? So you could call that a subset of part versus whole. Because I'm making an assumption about the whole American voters, American workers, whatever else it is, based on a sample. Whether that sample is clearly unrepresentative, using Bernie Sanders' rally to stand in for all of the U.S., or more broadly, just like, hey, we saw a sample, we asked some people, but do they stand in? We always are making an assumption when we say that has to be true. Sometimes we'll run with that assumption. If I survey, I would never be able to do this. If I talk to 20% of Americans randomly sampled and, they strongly favored something, I might then say, hey, that's a really big sample size, I'll go with it. But it's still making an assumption. We don't know what will happen. We barely know what will happen when we ask everybody, right? Maybe they change their mind. Okay, straw man. This is a favorite of internet arguers, right? They're always accusing each other. That's a straw man, dude, right? They often don't know what they're saying. But a straw man is when you attack something. It's kind of ironic given what it means. It's when you attack something that someone's not saying, right? So if someone says, well, a lot of brands of toilet paper are made from, virgin forest and cause deforestation. So it can be really harmful to the environment when we buy those kinds of toilet paper. You're saying, oh, so you don't want me to use toilet paper now. I see. It's like, no one said that you shouldn't use toilet paper. Hold on, right? So we know to be very careful we're not attacking an argument that was never made. We like to do this in real life because it tends to make our foes look foolish if we can get away with it, but it's a mistake. And that leaves unproven versus untrue. Some people think all of these are unproven versus untrue because it's like, hey, you haven't proven your conclusion, but we're specifically talking about, were we able to, is there proof of something versus is it actually true? So this one, number 7, it's the only one left, right? Is saying, hey, I don't have proof, so it didn't happen, right? I've never seen a zombie, so zombies aren't real, right? I'm going to run with that, but okay. But it could go the other way around. I could say, you haven't proved that zombies aren't real, so they are. So either of those would be just mixing up whether we have proof for something, versus whether it's true or not. I can say there's no proof of it, so it's not true. Or I could say there's no proof it's not true, so it is. And either of those is a mistake. Okay. Before we move on, questions about any of those? These aren't the absolute be-all, end-all definitions of these terms, but they'll be good enough for now. So if anyone wants to, take note of those, that's useful to do. You can always come back and watch the video as well. But we're going to try applying these to some actual arguments in a sec. So I just want to see if anyone has any questions before we do that. Okay. All right. Well, let's try this now. What we're going to do is I'm going to give you some arguments. I'm not going to give you 12 this time. I'm just going to give you 5, but I'm going to give you actual arguments. I'm going to give you, non-abstract statements. And I want you to spot which 5 flaws are represented in these. They're all from the list. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. These aren't all the famous flaws. I picked 12 fairly good ones, fairly common ones. But there are more. Partly depends on when you look at it. Sometimes we'll use a term we'll just say term shift. I'm a little hesitant with the one term shift. So a term shift is anytime, imagine I said something like this. Alice is kind to others, so she is a good person. Well, this is sort of just an all-purpose gap in an assumption. Wait, we're assuming that if you're kind, you're good, right? Basically, if you're kind to others, you're a good person. Not totally crazy, but not justified. I could just as well have said she's a bad person. They're both equally justified in terms of what we have here. I could just as well have said she's an elephant. Alice is kind to others, so she's an elephant. The point is we don't have anything that says if kind to others, then conclusion. So no matter what it says, whether it's something like this that seems to us maybe kind of reasonable, or something crazy like she's an elephant, the point is we don't know. Right? We don't know if it's true. So sometimes we call this a term shift. Often it'll be when they swap out something that's really similar, right? There's one LSAT problem that talks about whether something is low in fat or helps you to lose weight, and then one of the answers talks about nutrition, and who says that's the same thing, right? So we're often watching out for those. The reason I don't push the phrase term shift too much is it can become a catch-all for all of these. Well, these are all term shifts, right? And I don't necessarily want to do that. Okay, so let's see if we can find what each of these is. I'll give you a moment to do that. All right, how are we doing? Anyone want any more time? Are we all right? Okay. So the first one, notice, is going from the professors in the history department to the history department as a whole. And in this case, it doesn't matter so much what they say. It's going to be the same kind of flaw every time, right? This one seems kind of reasonable. If all the professors have written books on medieval periods, on the medieval period, then you might figure they're medieval historians. And if they're all medieval historians, maybe it's a medieval history department. But it's not necessarily that simple, right? Maybe they've written books on, the Enlightenment as well, but it's not an Enlightenment department or whatever it is, right? Or maybe you're allowed to study other stuff. These people just happen to all be medieval experts, right? Maybe every historian has to write these at one time. But imagine if I said, like, all the professors in the history department are women, so it's a women's history department. You'd say, well, it consists of women, but does that make it a women's history department? Or what if I said they're all old? Is it an old history department? Oh wait, that doesn't make sense, right? I guess all history is old, right? So this is a part versus whole for sure, right? we don't know that what applies to the individual works of the professors applies to the professor work as a whole or to the department as a whole. Okay, so it's kind of two-part versus whole, flaws in one. Number two is saying that if you're in Professor Wright's class, you have to read this book. Chloe's reading this book, so she's in Professor Wright's class. Right? What do we call that? Just write it like this. If you're in Wright's, you read Cather. So she read Cather, so she's in Wright's class. It's not quite circular reasoning. Circular reasoning would be something like Professor Wright will assign us to read Willa Cather because he plans to assign to us to read Willa Cather. I mean, it's something that silly, which is why we almost never see them. And it's not a false choice because they're not saying if you don't do this, you will do that. So a false choice would be something like, well, if we don't read Richard Wright, now I'm making another Wright. If we don't read Richard Wright, we're going to read Willa Cather, right? If I conclude that, or maybe a better way to say that would be, hey, we're not going to read Richard Wright this semester, so we must be reading Willa Cather. And there's that assumption that we always have to read one of those two, right? So it's not about a choice. Notice the arrows. This is about conditional reasoning. The premise, this part is the conclusion, right? The first part is the conclusion, and the second is justifying it. This is the premise. And so they're saying, if you're in Mr. Wright's class, Professor Wright's class, whoever, you're going to read this book. And now we're saying, well, she's reading this book, so she's in Professor Wright's class. That's an illegal reversal. It's flipping it around. Did everyone see that? So we can't do that, right? What we can do, what would be correct to say, would be, hey, if you don't have to read Willa Cather, then you must not have taken Professor Wright's class. One of the literature professors at my school was really into Bruce Springsteen, and he wanted to teach like rock songs as poetry. And pretty much if you took his class, you were going to be exposed to Bruce Springsteen, right? So no Bruce Springsteen, you probably didn't take his class. Okay, so if Wright, then Cather, does not tell us if Cather, then Wright. So that's something to get really comfortable with. You're going to see this over and over and over again. So it's a subset of conditional logic flaw. And it's a good example of one because it doesn't ever say if then. It just makes an absolute statement. Everyone in Wright's class has to read Willa Cather as my Antonia, and every absolute statement is a conditional, every single one. So if I just say something like, all humans are crazy, right? That's a conditional because I'm saying if you're a human, you're crazy. If you just say something as simple as, I like chips, even that is an absolute, and it's therefore a conditional because you can just say, hey, if someone is me, then they like chips. It might seem stupid to write it that way, but it is a conditional, right? Because if someone doesn't like chips, then they're not me. You know, is kind of what that gets at. Okay. Now, number 3 is interesting because that has a recommendation. I'm always nervous when they make recommendations of what you should do. It's very hard, as some people say, to get ought from is. Even if I know something very clear, like if you play soccer on the freeway, you'll get hit by a car. Can I say you shouldn't play soccer on the freeway? Depends on what your feelings are about getting hit by a car. I don't think you should do it. I would tell you you ought not to do that, but I can't really conclude that. It's up to you what you ought to do, I guess, sort of. So anytime we say what you should do, we're making an assumption. But there's another more specific assumption we're making here. We're saying, hey, these people in Okinawa, they eat a lot of fish. And the people in Okinawa live longer than anyone else. And that's true, right? By the way, if you're curious, people have been studying them for a while. Can I then say, therefore, that you should eat fish? What's the problem with this? What's wrong with saying, hey, the Okinawans live a long time and they eat a lot of fish, so the fish is the secret, Fish is the key. Right? Imagine I said this. Imagine I said, my aunt lived to 120 and always kept her hair in long braids. So anyone who doesn't want to die yet should grow their hair long and braid it. I mean, maybe, right? Now, in that case, there's definitely a sampling issue because it's like one person. If I looked at all old people, it might be another story. If I look at all old people and they all have long braids, then it might be at least something to consider, although there may be other things going on. Maybe it's just something that one does as one gets old. It doesn't cause a longevity, but it could definitely be a sampling issue. So I won't argue with that. But notice here that we have said that in general, Okinawans live longer than anyone else, at least on average, and they eat a lot of fish. And so that gets us down to a causation one. It's not unproven versus untrue because this is true. They've told us as a fact that they do live longer and that they do eat fish. So there's nothing that we don't know about. What's missing though is the causation, right? We don't know that living longer is caused by eating fish, right? What if I said that, most of them also speak Japanese? Okay, well, does just speaking Japanese make you live longer? Maybe that's just a coincidence of where they are. You know what I mean? It's not something peculiar to that, right? Or if I said, hey, very, very old people tend to like old music, so you should listen to old music too. And it's like, well, no, maybe they just like it because it's from a long time ago and they're old, right? It doesn't necessarily have a causal relationship. So even in cases where it seems very, very clear, right? Like let's say 5 of us are in a car and we get in an accident and I don't have my seatbelt on and everyone else does. And I get hurt really badly and everyone else is fine. You might say, see, Dmitry, that's why you need to wear your seatbelt. And that would make sense, right? But do we know that I was injured more because I wasn't wearing my seatbelt? Well, correlation never equals causation. Never. In real life, we might put that together and see what happened. If we knew more, oh, well, I was injured because I was thrown forward or whatever. But even that, is that really why I was injured? Is it really? And so in real life, we can always investigate and sort of determine better. On the LSAT, we only have a limited amount of information. So pretty much anytime we see those two together, it might be super obvious. I fell off the roof and I have a broken leg. Well, did I fall off the leg because I had a broken leg? Or did I actually break my leg when I fell off the roof? Oh, I don't know. So watch out for that. Okay, next one. Alicia has made it known that she would drop out of the contest for class president if George ran. Since George just announced he's running, he will be unopposed. Okay. So if George runs, Alicia's going to drop out. So George has got no opposition, right? What's the problem with this? Could someone still run against George? Right? Maybe someone else is going to jump in. The head of Starbucks, George's twin brother, Alicia's twin sister. Could someone else run against George? All we know is Alicia's dropping out, right? So what kind of assumption is that? What kind of flaw? Hey, it could happen. Yeah, it's a false choice, right? In real life, sometimes we feel like we're pretty sure, right? So far, these days at least, it seems like if the Democrat doesn't win, the Republican will, and vice versa in big elections, right? But we don't know that for sure, right? And in other cases, it might be a clearly really bad choice, right? If I say, oh, I don't know, my friend didn't show up for work and didn't call in sick, so they must have died. It's like, well, wait a minute, aren't there other things that could have happened, right? Is it really it? Maybe they just slept in, so be careful about false choices, right? Okay, last one. The number of personal watercraft accidents has risen steadily over the past 2 years. That's a bummer. Riding a personal watercraft has apparently become more hazardous despite technological advances. Now, I'm going to cut you off before you say this circular reasoning, because like I said, they're almost never circular reasoning. This could look like it's just repeating itself. And that's one of the reasons they like it as a bad answer choice, because if we're not careful, a lot of these will look like circular reasoning. Oh, they're saying that there's more accidents and they're concluding that it's hazardous. Well, don't those mean the same thing? Well, not quite. Is it possible that riding one of these jet ski watercraft things has gotten safer, even though the number of accidents has gone up? Is there a way for that to be true? What if I told you that more people are murdered in Philadelphia per year right now than were murdered per year in Philadelphia in 1800? Right? So, so the Philadelphia murder rate, uh, number of murders in Philly in 2018, let's say, was greater than the number of murders in Philly in 1800. Can I conclude that Philly has gotten more dangerous? I imagine this would have to be true. And I'm not a Philadelphian. I'm not an expert on Philadelphian crime statistics. I would imagine this would have to be true. Why is the number of murders in Philadelphia almost certainly higher now than it was in 1800? It'd be a real bummer in a sense if it hadn't. What's changed in the past 200 years that we have to think about when we're counting stuff? And this is not any kind of trick question about US geography or demographics, right? Simply, there's a whole lot more people, right? So the rate, the rate per 100 people, the percent could have gone way down, and the number could still go up, right? So yeah, so this is a percent versus amount. See what I mean? There weren't very many people in Philadelphia in 1800. I mean, it was a big city, right, for the time, but it was pretty tiny. I have visited historical Philadelphia. There were not room for that. There's not room for that many people. So unless they were just killing each other constantly, the rate would have to have gone up. And that's a percent versus amount thing. So look at this watercraft thing. Maybe watercraft have gotten really popular. Maybe the economy is booming and everyone has one. So there's more accidents, but it's not necessarily more hazardous for any given person to do it. So it depends on what you mean by hazardous, right? Um, for instance, maybe more people die in plane crashes now than a long time ago, even though planes used to crash a lot more because they were still figuring out how to fly them. But now it's just so many millions of people fly that, even if it only very rarely happens, that's a lot of people. Plus you can fit more people on a plane or whatever, right? But we don't necessarily know anything about the relative percent from that. Okay, so that's something to watch. Grace, does that make sense? I see you humming at me. All right, cool. Let's try putting this together on an official problem. And so I'm going to give you one. It's not a flaw question explicitly; it's a weaken question. But when we're doing weaken questions, we want to be able to still think about this in terms of flaws. So there will be several possibilities in this one. I'll tell you in advance, there's more than one way we could think about it. And the trick is what makes sense to you in terms of what's wrong with this argument. So I'm just going to give you the argument itself. I'm not worried about the answer choices right now. I want to give you a moment to read over the argument and see what's wrong with this and how might we describe this flaw. There's several possible ways to do it, depending on your perspective, but I'd love to hear what you have. So take a moment to look at that. All right, so what do we see here? We looked at people who got shorter term treatment, 6 months or less, and people who got longer treatment. We don't know how long, but apparently more than 6 months. And a larger percent of them said things got better. It can't just be percent versus amount because they said percent versus percent, right? And so they're saying that the longer treatment is more effective. It's better. What assumption or flaw types did you spot here? I would say there's a few. What did you spot? And we can get rid of some while you're thinking. I'll cross out a few that I think we can agree are not there. There's no ad hominem. We're not attacking anybody, right? It's not circular reasoning and almost never is. And, we don't want to talk about, we didn't say in advance that the treatment was more effective. So I'm seeing 3 so far. False choice, causation, unproven versus untrue. Careful. I think unproven versus untrue is maybe not as common as some of you want it to be. Unproven versus untrue is where we say, hey, we don't know this, so we know it's not true, right? And that's a really different thing. Unproven versus untrue is what my third graders used to do when I taught third grade. Someone would go, hey, that's my pencil. And the other kid would say, I don't know if it's yours. In other words, meaning therefore it's not, so I got to keep it. It's like, well, it's not yours, right? Give it back, right? So it's not unproven versus untrue. They never make a claim about truth based on whether there is evidence or not, right? They give some evidence and they make a conclusion, but that's every argument. Every argument gives some evidence and makes a conclusion. And every argument, the conclusion is not necessarily true. But unproven versus untrue is only when they say, hey, either we can't prove this, so it's not true, or we can't disprove it, so it is true. They didn't do that. Okay. As I said, it's not percent versus amount because they're only comparing percents. They never compare amounts. Comparison as a whole, absolutely, right? So notice that they said more thing, so if we look at this in terms of why it's a comparison, they said more people said they felt better, and then they concluded, so the treatment is more effective. Well, who says that's how that works, right? I might feel terrible coming in from the doctor, but the treatment might have been effective. You might think with psychological treatment it should be different, but we don't know, right? Depends on what I'm getting treatment for, right? So they're making a leap that may be true, but we don't know. We don't know that just because people said they felt better doesn't mean it's more effective, right? I also saw causation. Yeah, do we know why the people felt better, right? So let you know, if people felt better, was it because of the treatment? Maybe the people who got more than 6 months of treatment were rich and they could afford it, and it was really being rich that made them feel better, not the treatment. And the folks who could only afford 3 sessions feel terrible, not because they need a treatment, because it's hard to be poor while you're suffering with a personal problem at the same time. What else? False choice. They didn't say, hey, it's either this or this, and it wasn't, it's either A or B and it's not A kind of thing. So I don't think we call it a false choice. Would be if they said, let's say Dan didn't get more than 6 months of treatment, so he must have gotten less than 6 months of treatment. And you said, oh, well, what if he got exactly 6 months of treatment? Or Dan, Dan didn't see a Freudian therapist, so he must have seen a Jungian therapist. Well, wait, what are there other kind of therapists, right? Conditional has absolute in the conclusion. Therefore, this causes that, but there isn't a conditional premise. There isn't a premise that says, if you have this, then that. So it's not an illegal reversal, right? But you're absolutely right. They are saying, the conclusion does say, if greater than 6 months, right? If greater than 6 months, not 60 months, then that's more effective than the short term, right? Now, technically that is a conditional, but notice it's really more of a comparison, and it's not based on another conditional. They didn't say, if you get 6 months of treatment, it's going to be expensive. Therefore, if you get 6 months of treatment, it's going to be effective, or something like that. Okay. I think another one you could attribute to this is sampling flaw, which if you saw that way, then you could also call that part versus whole. Do we know if these people are representative, right? We know that that we talk to, it says of those responding, right? It says of those responding, but we don't know whether the people who are responding are representative. It's like I said, the people who are home maybe aren't the ones that are the norm. Maybe those are the unusual ones. Okay. There's no straw man. They don't attack an argument that's not there. They don't attack anything. It's not a legal reversal. It's not a false choice, as we said. And there's no appeal to any kind of authority, appropriate or otherwise. So I would say, depending on how you're looking at it, it could be any of the others. A causation flaw because, hey, how do we know that it's the therapy that was effective and not something else? A comparison flaw, hey, just because they feel better, how do we know that it was more effective? And then part versus whole or sampling, kind of the same thing. How do we know that the people who responded represent the whole? Okay, so let's look at the answer choices, then we're going to wrap up here. One thing that's interesting in the answer choices, and I'll tell you to watch out right now, is that they have things that look like they might correspond to one of those flaws, but don't quite do it correctly. So I'm going to cross off one of the answers. I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to cross off one of the answers. I'm going to cross off B. And as you go through, I want to see, does B look tempting to you, and what's wrong with it? Because a lot of people are going to like B, and I'm going to tell you in advance that it's wrong, and see if with that little leg up, we're likely to pick the right answer. So take a moment and just chat in the answer when you have it. How are we doing here? Chat in an answer if you got one. If you're not feeling great, tell me if there's any that you can say you don't like. What are some answers that you feel pretty confident getting rid of? I think we can safely say a few of these just don't matter. So if we look at E, E says what many psychologists encourage people to do. I don't care. One reason I don't care is that many is a very meaningless term. When I say many, there's a lot of psychologists in the world, right? There are many psychologists. So when I say many, am I talking about 5, 100, 80%? Like, what am I dealing with? The other problem is that even if every psychologist encourages their patients to receive treatment for longer than 6 months, that doesn't help me assess whether it's a good idea or whether it works. I can't just say, well, if psychologists encourage it, that's a sign that it's great. If anything, then you'd think if we did like that, then you'd think it would strengthen. Oh, if psychologists say so, then it must be good to have. But we don't know that one way or the other. So E is kind of irrelevant. Yeah, Tyler, A I can get rid of as well. 10% said that treatment made things feel worse. That's a bummer. That's a bad thing for the long term. But what about the short term? What did they say? Right? So we have no way of comparing. We have no comparison to the shorter ones. Is this better or worse than the alternative, right? So if a bunch of my students say that their score went up after taking my class, but 10% said their score went down, and you say, don't take Dmitry's class, hold on, how does that compare to any other option? What if, most classes, half the student scores go down? Oh no, right? I'm sure that's not true, but something to think about for sure when we compare. Thanks, Grace. We're wrapping up in just a second anyway, so thanks for all your participation. All right, so that leaves us with C and D, although we have to talk about why B is wrong. D is interesting because it talks about people who are dissatisfied, feeling a need to return the survey. So it's saying that we're going to have a high negative rate, right? So we can expect a disproportionate number of negative reviews, right? You see it a lot on Yelp or something like that. The people who care are the ones who write reviews, and that's either people who love it or hate it, right? Maybe more who hate it, whatever, right? So we can just expect a disproportionate number of negatives, but it's for both. Now, if it said people who are dissatisfied with their treatment were more likely to quit soon and leave a negative review, then you'd say, aha, so what's going on is the dissatisfied people stopped, and that's actually what makes C the right answer. It's a causation flaw, right? It addresses causation. So this is an alternative cause. We sometimes also call this a selection effect, right? It's that success caused the longer therapy, not the other way around. In other words, they did longer therapy because they were succeeding. That doesn't necessarily mean that the succeeding made them do therapy for longer. Right? That doing therapy for longer made them succeed. Do we see that? It's like if I said something like, someone works a lot of hours and they get paid well. So working a lot of hours must be good for your pay. Well, maybe, or getting paid well motivated them to work a lot of hours. And so we don't necessarily know which way it's supposed to go, right? B is one of the more tempting ones, and I was trying to help out by crossing that one out. The problem with B is that it talks about whether they're more likely to return the survey, but notice that we don't know what % of people in each group return the survey. And what we do know is that it says of those responding. So if I just said like 20 people said things were better from the short-term group and 36 from the long-term group, if I was doing a % versus amount error, then B would matter. But since I've got that taken care of, I'm just saying, okay, yeah, but out of the people who responded, what do we have? Then whether there's a slightly different number of people who responded doesn't necessarily tell me anything. So that leaves me with C. Any questions on that? So this was definitely challenging. This is a weekend and we're applying flaw reasoning of saying what kind of flaws are here. What I'm getting at with this though is that the more readily we spot errors, the more likely we are to have something jump out at us out of the answer choices. So if you already spotted that this was making a causal error, you're much more likely to see answer choice C is correct, to have it jump out at you, than if you hadn't already spotted that. Now, it can be tricky. If you spotted this as a sampling error, then maybe you saw something as B or like B or D as addressing that sampling error, and that's understandable, even though in the end you have to watch for little things that make that not work out. But long term, you're going to do a lot better on this test if you're able to predict answers and recognize patterns of flawed reasoning. So that's a really important part of this. Okay. Well, I'm going to wrap up there. Thanks everyone for all your participation. If you want to check out any of our classes, please do. We'll have this up on YouTube very soon. Anything else that you'd like to ask me or talk about, feel free to let me know. Other than that, I'm going to close up shop. Thanks all for coming by. I hope to see you at the next one.